Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh.
So on the show today, Tony Zhou. So Tony is an arts-based somatic educator. Wide background. We're going to be talking about China, Chinese perspective, arts therapy, various things. Comes recommended to me. So Tony, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's my pleasure to be here with you and with our audience.
And can I hear a little bit about your life story then? So how did you get interested in somatic work, Tony?
Well, I think it seems a coincidence, but there is some personal story. I think I was trained as a biomedical scientist. It's a Western approach very much into micro things. But when I did my PhD in the university in Delft, I started to get contact with modern dance. And modern dance is very expressive, a free movement. And there, I think I was hooked by the creative movement. And later on, I met a very good dance therapist in Rotterdam. And, dance therapy is part of a somatic practice. And then, that is how I get connected. And then the micro and macro meet together and science and art meet together. And it just opened a new world for me. This is how I get into the embodied somatic world.
Okay, so tell us about what you do now. What kind of activities are you involved in? Are you teaching, doing workshops? What kind of things do you get up to?
Well, in terms of the somatic education, I, and together with the institute I established in China, were very much into the somatic education field. So we introduced the creative arts therapy, but very much body movement based. This training program into China. So bring a lot of trainers from the West to China to do the certification program. So a training program so that people who want to become dance movement therapist or the movement analyst or kind of somatic educator in general, and they come into our program. I was trained as a dance movement therapist myself, and also a certified movement analyst. But now I'm mainly into the organizing and designing the training program and managing the program for our students.
Got it. I'm fascinated to ask about China actually, because obviously cultural background, very rich. It's a huge country. It's a third of the world's population. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit of a mystery to me. I've only been to Hong Kong. Most of my background in Asian arts have been either Thai or Japanese. So I don't know, excuse my ignorance, I don't know much about Chinese culture. Mm-hmm. And I'm also really curious how somatic work is landing there. How is it being received in China, which has, its own rich history of martial arts and Tai Chi and meditation, all these other things?
Yeah, when we talk about somatic practice in China, we have to go back to the history. I think the somatic, this kind of body-mind integration was very much rooted in the Chinese history. China is not really, I would not say China is a religious country, but we have several kind of ways of believing or ways of living in China. And one of them is actually there are so-called three teachings. Mm-hmm. The three teachings, one is Taoism, another one is Confucism, another one is Buddhism. And we'll talk about the Taoism. Taoism is very much body-based. So they always talk about presence and also the grounding and also body. And I think already from 1,000 years ago, China already started to develop this kind of a belief in the body. And of course, later on, the mind sense, like Confucianism is very much corresponded to the people's mind about how you behave and how you have a relation with societies and from the families So this kind of a body, mind always together is not really separated in Chinese culture, and not give a very solid, very historical foundation of the somatic in China.
Yeah, I remember teaching in Hong Kong, and there's Hong Kong Chinese sort of came up to me and said, Mark, this isn't new to us. We've been understated. We've been doing this a little while. And even though the technique you're using may be a new technique, and we haven't heard this called centering before, or maybe we're not aware of what Feldenkrais is or dance movement therapy in these Western traditions, it seemed like there is, its own rich heritage of body-mind tradition, so that many of the things I was teaching just seemed very commonsensical to people rather than something exotic or unusual.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. And is there any tension there between sort of like Western somatics, which has its own tradition, and traditional approaches to body-mind work?
You mean between the West and the East?
Yeah, in terms of, a whole Western tradition of somatics, which you are now bringing to China, and there's already, many traditions of body-mind work there.
Sure. Well, I think the Chinese approach is just like the Chinese traditional medicine is very much a macro. It's very macro. It's just like a top-down approach. You always talk about the first nature and also the relation, a harmonious relation between human being and nature. So I think that the Chinese approach is really more macro, and the Western approach, I think the Western approach is very strong in the part and also analysis. Very good at look at the part. But I think there can be a kind of tension, but also I believe part and the whole, they're always kind of a paradox. They always support each other, just yin and yang. And of course, I can see sometimes we have a different perspective and different approach, how to deal with, the practice and how to deal with the client. But I would say this tension is meaningful.
Interesting. I'm fascinated by this, and I've seen tensions in different areas. So, for example, there's a Chinese mixed martial artist using sort of Western mixed martial arts, and he's been quite controversial in sort of fighting traditional Chinese martial artists, and there being, problems for him at a sort of government level, but also from sort of people not liking it, for example. Or, I'm wondering how it is received when you are teaching or hosting teachers of somatics in China.
Well, I mean, when we talk about we actually brought the down therapy. That was the first program we brought from the West, specifically from America to China. It was almost 10 years ago. And that is really the American approach, because we use ADTA, American Down Therapy Training Program, the guideline to China. And I still remember myself, as well as my country fellow, were so fascinated with this apparently new approach. And at the very beginning, I think Chinese culture usually is really modest. So we're always, we need to learn from the West, and the Western things is very advanced. And I think at the very beginning, we're more feel, we learn from the West. After a few years of training, and actually I found myself, but also our students really can feel, eventually that is a mutual flow. It's not only we learn from the West, but eventually we can find there are some very powerful strengths from the Chinese tradition. And there, after a few years, after you gain this kind of knowledge, and after you do a lot of reflection, you feel actually we are able to do the mutual dialogue between the West and the East.
Yeah. And so what needs changing? Because I'm really fascinated by culture, and we have guests on from all over the world, and I teach myself in many countries, and I really find it interesting as a teacher how I have to adapt to Israel or Russia or Brazil, different cultures I work in. And I find sometimes the Americans aren't so good at this, if I'm honest. In Europe, there's so many much smaller countries also close together. You have to get a better sense of cultural adaptation, when Germany's just across the border from Italy, it's not far,
Yeah.
So what changes, or what do you need to change or adapt when you're doing somatic work in China?
Well, I think it's about the local culture, or you call that localization, and how to adopt the Western approach and the Western teaching and the Western knowledge to the Chinese culture. And one of the things, for example, I can give you a concrete example, is about the warming up. The warming up, usually you, before you really start to do real work, you need to do the warming up. Not only the body warming up, but also the emotion, the mental warming up. Yeah. And we found out actually it takes much longer time. In general speaking, it takes much longer time for the warming up period in China. As far as I observe with my colleagues, take much longer compared to the counterparts in the West. So it seems that the Chinese, in the Chinese culture and Chinese people, they need more time to build up the trust before they're able to open themselves. But once they open themselves, it's amazing what you can see, how open they can be. So I think that is something, one example we need to consider, and how to bring kind of a body mind work to China with the Western approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think England is maybe in the middle here as well. I was surprised when I've taught in places like Brazil or the United States, how quickly people dived into things. I was used to slightly more reserved British or Dutch or German audiences at first, and then I was like, wow, these guys are really enthusiastic. This is easy in some ways, and then Russia's definitely, people take time to trust me as a teacher. They're quite suspicious and they guarded, and they don't want to, say anything in the group at first. And then eventually they're great, it's no problem, but it can take a little longer. So that makes sense to me as one difference. What about relationship to authority? That's one that I've come across can be quite different. Like American students or Dutch students will sort of invite me for tea and be very sort of pally, very friendly. Yeah. Whereas, Russian students or Japanese students will really keep a distance from me.
Yeah. True. That is because this is part of the culture and the history, the Confucianism. This kind of has a strong kind of influence in the Chinese culture and also the behavior of Chinese people. They always show respect to the authority. But saying so, I feel actually there is some changes already nowadays. The younger generation, I think their sense of individualism, the sense of their own personal identity is much, much stronger than, let's say, my generation, actually. And so I think that people nowadays, younger people, are more aware about their own value and or their own right. And they are less, less afraid of authority compared to the past.
Yeah, I've seen a difference. A lot of young Chinese come to the town where I live to study, and you have some contact with these young Chinese. They're usually sort of 18 to 25, and to study English and to study at the university here. It just seems to be a big exchange program or something with China, and I meet quite a lot of them. I've over the 15 years I've been in Brighton, I've seen a change in those young people that I meet, and the young people I meet from China now, they do seem to be a different, slightly different culture. It's the same in other countries. There's a globalization happening, perhaps.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And what about, is there a sort of implicit, explicit thing? So something I've come across in a few countries, again, Japan, for example, some other Asian countries, is a lot more implicit. And you have to sort of guess what's going on a lot of the time. Is that part of Chinese culture too?
Yes, I would say. I mean, if you have the experience watching the painting, the Chinese classical painting, and also you can see the big difference between the Chinese classical painting and also the Western oil painting, where you can see this kind of, I would say, this metaphor of the explicit and inexplicit. In the Chinese painting, you always feel it's not really so strong contrast. You can see the dark and the bright, but in the Chinese painting is like a kind of blurry. It's not very clear, and I think that is part of I consider it a part of the Chinese romance. Romance. The Chinese people have this kind of a romance going back to the Chinese classical literature and art. This kind of implicit is part of the romance, I have to say.
I did date a Chinese girl before I got married some years ago, and it was mysterious, but also sort of difficult because I never quite knew what was happening.
Yeah. I feel, as an Asian, I feel a little bit more sometimes. I feel a little bit, if I talk about the yin and yang, I feel this kind of yin energy a little bit more embedded in the Chinese or Asian culture. And this kind of yin energy is corresponded to implicit, indirect, and this kind of thing. But I feel that implicit and also yin can be also very strong, not less, and also can be very powerful.
Well, let's talk about strengths then. So what do you think, as somatic practices spread and are embedded in China, and these kind of newer Western somatic practices meld with some of the traditional ones maybe, what do you think China will really bring to this whole field?
Well, I think that is a little bit more, some ancient philosophical wisdom. It's not only about technique, but it's a way of thinking. It's also a kind of wisdom at the philosophical level. And I myself also feel fascinated, and also I'm still trying to learn more from the ancient Chinese wisdom. And I feel that one thing I feel that China contribute very much is about the Tao. The Taoism, Tao. When we talk about Tao, and I mentioned to you my topic I want to talk about today is the flowing Tao. It's always kind of a mixture of the two duality. And that is, flowing Tao. Flowing means freedom, and Tao means a structure. So there's a way, but they're always together. And I feel that this one has been in Chinese culture for a long time. And also, I appreciate very much is about the harmonious relationship between human being and nature. It's not only the physical connection, but also the mind connection and also spiritual connection. And I think that is one of the biggest contributions the Chinese approach can bring into the somatic practice, a little bit more macro and also philosophical level.
Yeah, that makes sense. When I've come across Chinese martial artists, for example, they all often have this like very integrated and big picture way of looking at the world. Like it wasn't just a throw, it was a whole philosophy. And combined often with a kind of poetry, I would find as well, a sort of poetical, beautiful kind of approach to the art rather than just technical or detail orientated. So this is something I've seen in martial arts quite a lot. Yeah. And before I want to ask you more about the Tao, but before we do, how much has things landed? Like what's popular in China? What has taken off? What has not taken off? It's just sort of this bamboo curtain in front of me. So I'm really curious, like what has, we have very few podcast listeners in China, for example, especially considering the size of the country. But I'm really curious, like what has become popular? What is anything really taken root there yet?
Well, I think it's about the freedom to feel as a lively person, and especially for China, who is developing so fast, and young people get a lot of stress and get a lot of burden. They really want to try to find themselves, and there is different approach to find themselves. In terms of somatics, I think that now this kind of body mind coming back again, but it's a different route, different way. I mean, I don't feel that younger people, they are into the Tai Chi, and also it's too slow for them. They are trying to find another way of body mind integration. So I see, a lot of dance, modern dance, free movement, this kind of thing really gain a lot of popularity among Chinese young people.
Okay, that makes sense. It's that the kind of integration of something that's maybe sexy and cool and from abroad, and in the same way as young people in the West were obsessed with kung fu and karate and things like this in the 70s. It was something exotic, and sometimes that thing from abroad can be more exotic and more interesting, and then naturally it gets blended with the culture and in time.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so let's talk more about. Do you pronounce it Tao or Dao? I've heard it pronounced both ways.
Actually, it should be Dao. Dao is Chinese pronunciation. D-O-A, D-A-O, Dao. So that is Chinese pronunciation. But in the West, people use Tao. So change D into T.
Okay, because I know it's written with a T sometimes, but I thought it was pronounced with a D. So that sort of clarifies it for me. So I love this topic, and actually I was introduced to Lao Tzu, the Dao Zhe Jing, I can't pronounce it very well, at 16 by my first love, believe it or not. My first girlfriend, my first love gave me this book, and it really had a sort of very special place in my heart, actually. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this area.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this I think this is very sophisticated way of thinking, but it looks very simple. It's just not so complicated. But it's just like the Tao and the yin and the yang. The most complicated things actually stay in the very simplest sense. So I found this is fascinating. And before, I always feel that the Tao is a structure, is about the discipline, the structure. But actually, the ultimate goal of Tao is the integration of the freedom and the structure. Mm-hmm. And I find it fascinating. And in the Tao, we're talking about the flows. This flow is a lot of imagination, is a lot of spontaneous, and this kind of energy is, the mingled with this kind of, how do you say, the Tao, the way which is defined by the universe, and human beings need to follow the way of the universe in order to maintain a harmonious relation with nature.
It's very obviously the basis of George Lucas's Star Wars, The Force. And it seems like a whole generation of Westerners have been almost initiated into some idea of what this could mean. Silly as it sounds, Tony, so you have to forgive my very silly parallel here, but that's what resonates with me as someone who grew up in Western culture when I hear you say this.
You are referring a person from the West?
Yes, so the Star Wars series, which is very popular, obviously in the West, has this concept of the Force and harmonizing with the Force as nature, and it seems like it's been directly lifted from this Chinese philosophy.
Could be. I don't know how they got the inspiration. It might be.
So how would this apply actually in life, though? So this is this very, deep but somehow abstract and big picture thinking. Let's take this right down to ground level. What does this mean? What does this understanding actually mean for us in daily life?
You mean the Tao philosophy, this kind of thing?
Exactly. Like kind of what's the so what? I'm asking a very direct Western question here, but what's the, how does that all land in our daily life in practicalities?
Well, I think there are two things in my mind. One is I think that in the Chinese daily life, the Chinese people, doing their cooking, they are not really thinking a kind of Western nutritious way, proteins and the fat, this kind of thing. They are more thinking about the kind of Taoism way, and what kind of a feature of the food. It's hot. It's not temperature, but it's like kind of Chinese medicine. It's yin or yang. It's hot or it's cold, and how this one corresponds to your body condition. And I think that people are very much into this kind of Chinese way of thinking in their daily life, in their eatings and the other things. And in terms of the somatics trainings and practice, and I feel that our teachers, either our Chinese trainers or the Western trainers, always manage to bring some of the students from the sky to the ground, because some of the students are very much kind of floating with their kind of spirits and with kind of sense of acceptance, but sometimes you don't really have the very grounded connection to their body, with the field. Now we're always able to bring them back, and this bring them back, they don't really feel strange because they understand what body means. And it's just like I think they start to forget this kind of a body grounding in the kind of modern busy life.
Break to tell you about our program. So as well as the podcast, we have various kinds of online training. So we have the Embodied Yoga Principles online training, as well as in-person training. Embodied Yoga Principles for yogis who want to get yoga off the mat, specialize in the psychology of yoga, unique postures. It's a 5-day training. We have one in Brighton, one in Berlin, and one in Austin, Texas. So if you go to Embodied Yoga Principles, you can find them. Also the online version of the training for people who can't make those dates. Excellent courses. The Embodied Yoga Principles training for the yogis. For the coaches and facilitators, we have the Embodied Facilitator Course. This is our flagship course. We offer it in Moscow, also in the UK. A 9-month adventure, real deep dive into embodiment. It's the biggest embodiment program I do. It could be like movement people who want to work in business more. We have people like dancers and martial arts teachers come to learn more about working in mainstream settings, but also for coaches and trainers who want something really well structured, who want to work on themselves, want to learn practical tools, learn how to work with the body in facilitation. If you can't make EFC, and it is a big ask, there's an online course we run called the Foundations of Embodiment Certification. So if you go to Embodied Facilitator, you'll find the in-person and then /FEC, FEC, F for Freddy, EC for Charlie, FEC. You'll come up with the Foundations of Embodiment Certification, and also do one-day events all around the world. So I'm just about to do a tour to Slovenia, Berlin, Copenhagen, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Brighton. The Brighton one is £10, which is like $15. So if you're coming from abroad, that could make that affordable. The Brighton one's always like a really big fun one, so that's coming up. Again, go to the Embodied Facilitator course to see all of these events. And we have a little online evening as well. If people just want a taster, again, that's £10. That's a 3-hour thing coming up as well. Embodiedfacilitator.com, embodiedfacilitator.com, and you'll find all those events with Embodied Yoga Principles for the yoga ones. Okay, so that's the stuff that I sell. Oh, and the book, the Embodiment book. If you want to get my book and learn about embodiment through reading, you can also get the Embodiment book available at Amazon and no good bookstores. So there we go. Excuse the interruption, and back to the episode.
Sometimes another thing I hear is a sort of idealization of Asian cultures. People in the West can be quite in love with Asian cultures. People like myself who've done martial arts or Tai Chi or whatever, and they'll say, "Oh, they're all, they're super embodied. Everyone in Asia is super embodied, or oh, Chinese people don't need embodiment." So, what would you say to that?
Well, I think we do need, let's say, embodiment. It's like it was so common that I feel that people in China, in Asia, at least in China, maybe take that for granted. We don't really kind of, traditionally, we don't have to specifically mention, or we need to kind of embodiment, but the embodiment is already, implemented in daily life. But I feel now this embodiment is emphasized in the modern Chinese people's life, is because now with our life, we see the kind of separation of the body and mind. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is why that this word become a kind of fashion, coming back.
Yeah, and do you think it will be a fashion in China? Do you think this is something that will actually take off?
Yes, I think so. I mean, maybe it's just the name, but this kind of concept of body-mind integration is very much needed in China now. And I see because China has opened itself, let's say 45, 50 years ago, and you get a lot of things from the West. Mm-hmm. And also another thing is modern technology. We're talking about the information technology and also the biotechnology, which has a dramatic impact on the Chinese people's life. And in another one, this technology kind of push us to get separated from our body. And
the young, if I can jump in, the young Chinese that I've seen are massively hooked to their mobile phones.
Yes.
I was in a restaurant full of Chinese people the other day. I go to a Chinese restaurant where it's normally me and my wife, the only Caucasians there. Yeah. And it was full of young people and not one of them was speaking to each other. They were all on their mobile phones around the dinner table. And now I do sometimes see that also with people here. That's not an unknown phenomenon with teenagers in Britain.
Yeah.
But this was really noticeable. It was, several hours they were ignoring each other almost.
Yeah.
Thought, wow, these people are really tech addicted. I don't know if that's a representative sample of young people there, but certainly is what I saw.
It is. It's very worrying, and I see this everywhere. In China, of course, in the big city, I was really surprised to see the same thing happening in Taiwan in the metro, and there I was so surprised to see not only the young people, but even the middle-aged people and the older people. They are hooked to the mobile phone and they don't really look at each other. I was really shocked.
Wow. And so what's your sort of hope for this work then? Do you have a sort of vision of this stuff spreading in China? I mean, are there dangers in that? I mean, if I think of the sort of some movements that have spread in China that have, things have been sort of stamped down on. I had a friend that had a bodymind business that got closed down there. I mean, it's, what's your hope for how this might expand and be influential?
Well, I hope that we can gain some consciousness of the body mind and also our connection between human being and nature at different level. At individual level, each of us as a human being, at the educator level, talk about the educator in general, including somatic educator. We need to we need to have the conscious increased on that. And also very important is about the governmental level. I think the authority, they also who are making the policy and also the law of the country also need to be aware that the technology bring us a lot of things, but at the same time, another side of the duality is also, it shouldn't be underestimated. Or shouldn't be, we should pay attention to that.
Yeah, and the whole world's waking up to that, aren't we? They say in Silicon Valley, in America, a lot of people there who work in the industry won't let their children have phones until they're 10 years old. And, I definitely see parents in Britain talking about this. It does seem to be like a global conversation right now.
No, it's not. And actually, recently I read a book. It's called How to Break Up with Your Mobile Phone. I think probably you also read that book. It's written by an American author. It's a very short book.
How to break up with your mobile phone.
Yeah, how to break up with your mobile phone. They mention there's quite some the CEOs from Silicon Valley. They just forbid their own children to get contact with their mobile phone.
And that's crazy I recently made my phone black and white, and that sounds like a small thing, but it makes it far less like eye candy. Mm-hmm. And so occasionally I can still switch it to color if I need to view something that's in color. But I found that, and I've also set boundaries to myself that between, before 9 a.m. or after 9 p.m. I don't use it. Yes. And I bought some of these glasses which are sort of blue shifting, that if I do need to work at night, I can use those. And I put a few little things in place. And I've noticed how difficult it is. It's not so easy to stick.
It is because there's hundreds of thousands of industrial engineers and designers. They know the psychology of the human being. They know how to make you addicted to the block.
It's like just me against all those guys, it can feel a little bit like an unfair fight sometimes. And
yes,
they even say on computer games how addictive it is as like a positive thing now, and I've fought major addictions in my life, drugs and alcohol, and I tell you what, it's even knowing what I know about addiction, it's not the easiest thing. So be interesting to see what happens with this in the world.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other topics that you wanted to talk about, or some things that you feel like, I can add something here for our audience? We have a little time, so is there anything else that you're this is a topic that I want to contribute to?
Well, actually, I am very interested in about the mutual flow or the kind of exchange between the West and the East.
Mm-hmm.
Just now you mentioned actually for the Western colleagues, sometimes they feel the Eastern still a little bit mysterious, and how this evolves. And also in the field of somatics, I know that there are quite some international organizations and also a lot of programs. There are many, they are kind of Western oriented. So I just want to hear a little bit more your Western perspective and how you, as an educator in the somatics, how you look at the exchange between the West and the East, and how you expect from the East for the, let's say, the development of our field in the future.
I think it's an interesting one. And what I see is that a lot of people like myself get enamored, fall in love with Eastern arts. And it might be yoga, it might be aikido, it might be kung fu, whatever. And then there's a sort of disillusionment. And for example, one realizes that Western values can clash. Let's say we talked about authority earlier, and we have a much, more democratic, maybe flatter way of looking at authority in most Western countries. And we see the abuse scandals coming out of, Indian yoga teachers, or, there was a time when I realized my Japanese aikido was really quite abusive, and there was no way to really feed back to him anything. Which is a kind of, Western value of there's enough equality that you could vote him out. There was no voting. It was essentially a feudal medieval Japanese dictatorship at work. And at a certain point, the Western values kick in. And then there can be a throwing that out completely. So I think that's a sort of journey I see a lot of people going through individually, but we're really going through that journey right now in the West, say in the yoga world, where there's this clash of values around openness and emotion and democracy and fairness and power. And I really see that happening en masse right now. So in a way, I see the sort of West becoming disillusioned with a lot of the East in the same way as in the 60s, everyone sort of fell in love with it, And I think once that's happened, we can actually have a mature conversation about what's good and what's not so good. But at the moment, I think we're still in the stage where that disillusionment is happening for many counterculture people. And just one last piece here, I see a lot of Westerners don't know what's great about the West. They don't. For example, if I have Japanese friends and they could really name what's great about Japanese culture, and they wouldn't be ashamed to say it, or Thai friends who would say, oh, we have this, we have that, we have this thing, that thing. And many Westerners are almost ashamed of the West. There's this sort of post-colonial guilt happening. Yeah, really? Yeah, for sure. For sure, they think Western things are bad. I mentioned Winston Churchill, and immediately all my friends are like, oh, but this guy did this wrong, and he did some bad things. But I'm like, well, let's also acknowledge him as a hero. Or Western culture, Western civilization. It's like, well, it's all just awful, evil, patriarchal, bad Western scientific oppression that's destroying nature without seeing the good things. And again, I don't think a mature East-West conversation will happen until the intellectual class of the West and the embodied class of the West acknowledge what's beautiful about the West as well as what's bad in our history and our current Sorry to take so long with that, Tony. How does that?
That's all right. That's all right. And it reminds me the kind of conversation I had in Thailand. I went to a kind of Buddha retreat center, and I did kind of retreat 2 days. So it's mindfulness training. So we got a very young monk who teach a group of students. I was one of them. And most of the students are actually the Western young people. They are there.
Mm-hmm.
So we had this kind of 2 days of training. And at the end of the training, and we were in a group and we ask questions. And then I think either I or another Western student asked question, what do you think about the West and the East? What do they can learn from each other? I think the monk mentioned that it's his observation. He said that he realized a lot of Western people are more critical. They don't really easily believe the authority,
Mm-hmm.
and they have critical thinking. And in that way, actually, this Thai monk, he was appreciating that attribute in a way. Okay, you need to be critical thinking. But another way, he said, okay, what I miss is a little compassion. It's kind of compassion, people towards other people, and also of the world. So this is his observation, and I think there's always like dualities in how you be obeying and believe other people. Another one to be critical, to be independent. This seems to be a kind of a constant dialogue between human beings and between different culture.
Yeah, and I've lived in 6 countries, and I been to a lot, and I'm married cross-culturally. My family are immigrants, so I'm really into this dialogue. And my conclusion is that there's no like good or bad culture, but there are good and bad sides to different cultures, and everything in a culture has a good and bad side. So for me, there's definite ways that are things I like about, say, Germany compared to Italy, but then it's sort of, this is very Taoist. Maybe it depends on the yin and yang. Like, am I on holiday or am I working? What time of year is it? Who am I with? All of those factors that I might say, that's great about Italy. They can turn on their head and be a complete nightmare if there's a different situation there. Like, it's very contextual, but that doesn't mean that all cultures are equal. All cultures may have equal value, but all cultures are really quite different. And I think that's another mistake I see kind of people in the West saying is like, hey, all cultures are equal, meaning the same, rather than of equal value. And I think that is a mistake. And we can, this old saying that hell is British food and Chinese policemen, whereas heaven is Chinese food and British policemen. And there's some truth in that we can take the best from different places. Well,
I realize with human being is facing a kind of crisis, a crisis that we are missing the leadership. I just feel people feel very confused and feel lost. And, in the past, maybe, either they're religious leaders or political leaders, people treated considered as a hero. Really, people have believed in that. But nowadays, what you see, there's so many crises in the world, and I think that people start to lose their belief. They feel frustrated, they feel disappointed. And where is the leadership? Where can we find the leadership? Do we find the leadership in the human being, or do we find the leadership in the universe, or in the nature, or in the body?
Right. There's definitely a disillusion with leaders. Like, I was thinking about this the other day, that Nixon had to resign because he spied on one office.
Yes.
Now we just assume we're being spied on through social media all the time. And we're not even angry about it. We don't expect our leaders to be any good anymore. There's a guy who was suicided in America recently, and it looked like he was involved with child sexual abuse involving hundreds, maybe thousands of sort of leaders, famous people in America. And he was very clearly killed in prison, and it was made to look like a suicide. And no one was even surprised. It just seemed like people were like, well, of course our leaders are awful pedophiles who have people murdered. I mean, you can't get much worse than that, And people are just like, well, of course, like rolling their eyes. Of course it wasn't a suicide, And it was like, wow, that's a low level of expectation for leaders. And as you say, where do we look if we don't trust leaders? Do we put ourselves as the center of the universe? Do we say that nature is? Do we, people are putting children in leadership positions because they seem sort of purer somehow, And I can see why they would put a child in a leadership position, because people are so sick of the corrupt adults, We're covering some ground here, Tony.
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation. I think that very, very nice, very stimulating.
Yeah, no, I'm finding it fascinating too. And what surprised you when you kind of came across Western somatics, or your first exposure to that? Do you remember? I know it's been a while now, but do you remember when you were in those sort of first dance movement therapy classes? Was there anything that you thought, wow, that's really foreign, or that's really weird?
Yeah, I think it was not really weird. It was kind of awakening. It was kind of excitement. And I still remember when I did this kind of experiential work with a dance therapist. I was in the studio, and I was trying to bring up the image of how I interact with my father, who is, of course, authority in the family. And then, a lot of memories and it's coming to my mind. And then I was able to express myself very freely with that whole environment. I was really feel so free, and it was so refreshing. And I feel that it's so powerful, this dance and movement. Of course, I feel that at the very beginning, okay, this is modern dance. This is a Western things. Mm-hmm. And I have been, believing this one is all Western approach. Until eventually I found out actually it was weakening of my own thing in my mind, of my body as a human being, but also as a Chinese people with a kind of Chinese culture. That one was weakened. It's not something it was created, but it was weakened.
And it is interesting that somatics does also, as well as bring us into contact with culture, it also brings us into contact with what's shared between all people. Mm-hmm. For example, there's some exercises around the fight or flight response that I've taught all over the world, and everybody has the same basic biology, Yeah. So it does bring us into contact with something shared as well, doesn't it, somatics?
You mean the sharing elements in the somatic?
No, the shared humanity, the shared biology, the fact that even though, yes, there's culture and that's really important.
Yes.
It brings us into contact with things that, like, I've been on dance floors with people. I don't even know what country they're from or what language they speak,
Right. That's true. That's true. That is a kind of a non-verbal communication interactions, and in that way, it's indirect, it's direct. It's direct in a way that you just, can try to interact and also get connected with other people without the language connection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It can skip some of those cultural differences in a way. It kind of can bypass them.
Correct. And I still believe this kind of unconscious collectiveness within human being across culture. Some of them you don't need to speak out, and you had better not speak out. And that is because that is beauty. That is sometimes it's a beauty. It's just like you play the violin, and sometimes you don't really have to tell the score. It's at a certain level you just know how you get connected with this kind of non-concrete sense, and think you had better not speak it out. When you speak it out, it's not beauty anymore.
I've totally ruined perfectly good dance relationships and aikido relationships by trying to have a conversation with the person and then finding out we had very different political opinions, and but actually there could be a beauty to that non-verbal relationship and connection that could just get ruined by making things verbal and explicit, I've found.
Yeah, I think it's a process. Sometimes both West and East we do have explicit and implicit, but the process can be different. The process of unfolding, the process of building the trust can be different. But eventually we'll be there all together. But the process is different, and we need to. I think as a therapist or the somatic practitioners, we need to really have a very deep understanding about this process and also show the respect to the different process.
Tony, maybe we'll start moving towards wrap up. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where should they go? What's the best website or best way to look you up?
They can either go to our website of our institute. If you can search the Inspiris Institute, or Inspiration International, they can find our website. And another thing they can find our work is about the journals website. Because about 5 years ago, I built up the international journal. It's called Creative Arts in Educational Therapy, and now become an open access journal. It means that all the articles are free. So there, if you search the CET, so the Creative Arts in Educational Therapy, Eastern and Western approach, you can find the website of the journal.
Great, and do send me those links, and we'll include them on the Embodiment Podcast site on the website.
Yeah,
If people are ever sort of, concerned about links or listening into this, there's a few related podcast listeners might want to listen to. We had Steve Rowe and Dylan Newcomb talk about yin and yang. We've had some Tai Chi teachers on as well. So it might be, if you've enjoyed some of this conversation, listeners about sort of Taoism, then that might be good ones to listen to too. Tony, do you want to finish us off with a sort of closing message about the body? So anything for listeners as a closing message?
Well, I would encourage my colleagues from both East and West to open themselves, open their body, open their mind to each other, to have more dialogue with each other. And I believe we as a human being, we can learn from each other quite a lot. And at the end, I also want to send you 2 invitations. One is please submit your articles with a Western and Eastern perspective to our journal, open access journal, so that we can disseminate the knowledge together with compassion to other human beings. And the second invitation, I would like to invite you, if you still have time, come to China in March for our international conference. It's called the CAET World Forum. So the Creative Arts Education and Therapy World Forum, which will be attended by the creative arts educators and therapists from all over the world.
Great. Tony, this has been a really rich cultural exchange. I've enjoyed it personally very much, and we'll definitely be giving you an invite to the Embodiment Conference as well, and hopefully getting some Chinese speakers there as well to sort of broaden it out a little bit globally. So maybe let's talk about that after we finish the call here. So Tony, Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark, for your invitation. I'm very glad to be able to share these my personal stories and my experience with you.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Embodiment Podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator Course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.